Today we're going to be talking all about Charlie and the incredible book that she's put out there and the very, very fascinating, complex, I don't want to say painful, but just beautiful and hard life you've lived. Charlie is one of the most accomplished and interesting people that I've ever met. She's an award-winning journalist, an author, documentarian, but she's also someone who's lived through some of the most intense trauma imaginable. Like, I'm going to get emotional. Welcome back to Becoming You. This is our second part of our episode with the incredible Charlie Webster. She's a survivor of sexual assault by a coach. She's experienced physical assault in her family and nearly died. And I don't want to give it all away. You need to read the book, and we'll probably talk about a little bit of it. But her story is really one of resilience and also a lot of deep curiosity about what makes people, including herself, tick. And I think that's what drew me to her when I got to know her better, is not only the fact that she's gone through more trauma than most people can imagine and talks about it in the most healthy, beautiful way. And she's also a very, very accomplished high achiever, which we'll also talk about what part of that came from trauma. But she has something that I find in common, is that this drive to understand like who we are and why we are that way. We're going to be diving into her book, Why It's Okay to Talk About Trauma, and into how we process trauma, a different way it manifests in our lives, some of the tools. So if you've ever felt like your past is still controlling your present and your future, this episode is for you. So Charlie, welcome back.
Thank you. It's emotional. Sometimes I don't know why I'm laughing. It's not funny, but I think that's sometimes how we cope, right? But I'm so glad. I really wanted to write this book, and I was in two minds, like what to write. Did I make it like a full-on memoir, or did I make it something that I felt could help people go through their own journey? And that's what I just was leaning through all the time. So I tried to combine the both, basically, and use...
It's a teaching memoir.
Yes. Yeah, teaching memoir. That's great.
That's how I write, is always like, it's my lived experience, but also let's not diminish the fact you've done massive amounts of research. And so you're not just saying like, here's my experience and what I think about it. You're saying, here's my experience. Here's all that I've learned to better understand it. And here is how I'm going to share it.
Yes. Yeah. Because I want it to be like a tool that people can use, and a safe space as well, to feel validated, to feel listened to feel less alone in your own feelings. And so I wanted it to be like a companion that helps you work through trauma. And it is written like that. So it starts you off and works through the process. It was actually exactly everything that has helped me.
I have to lavish some compliments on you right now, and you just have to sit and uncomfortably receive them. Before we dive into everything the book is about, I think I bought the book, the Kindle, and then the Audible when it came out. And then it's been on my book list, and I have not been as good at reading or listening as I'd like. But about a month and a half ago, my husband and I started our own little book club. And so we've been working through books that we each pick. Well, you were on my list for like March. But then when I found out we were interviewing, I was like, okay, we're moving it up. And so I just binged for the last 2 days. So you have been in my head a lot and in my ear. And we'll talk about the end. I listened to the end this morning as I was getting ready for this podcast. And I was like, don't cry. You already put mascara on. But I have to tell you this. I had listened, so in the last month and a half, to How to Do the Work and to The Body Keeps Score, which are two, pretty prolific, well-known books, I would say, in this space. And I loved your book so much more than either of those, even though I got great things out of both of those. And I think it's a few things. So one is, you're a storyteller. I mean, you're a journalist, you're a researcher, but the story is so consumable with still being accessible, where I didn't feel that as much with the holistic journalist, though. If she ever comes to the podcast, I still like the book.
No, but I did that on purpose. So I'm really glad that you think that, genuinely, because I feel the same as you. I feel like, sorry to interrupt you, but I feel like that's why I wrote it. Honestly, you just literally encapsulated it. But because I sometimes, I've read those books too. And as much as they are brilliant and they serve a purpose, for me, there was always a barrier, and they didn't quite feel like, okay, I understand that, but I really want to feel this. I want to feel like somebody's with me, and I want to really relate it to my own life and be able to work on things. And as much as those books, are incredible, they were just a very different way of doing things. For me, I wanted it to be very close and intimate and honest, because I really don't agree with, sorry to say this, but certain books where it's like, do this in 10 steps, and they're just so marketable. And I was like, I don't care about that. As long as it helps people, that's what I want to do. I'm not going to create a book that's just going to be 10 steps to get over your trauma, or like, how to be happy after trauma. Like, I just don't believe in that stuff because it's just not real life. And I think it can be a bit irresponsible because it isolates people even more, where you think, well, I'm not happy. I'm still struggling with this, because you feel like that's judging you. So thank you for saying that.
No, it was just the perfect combination. And now I'm putting it on my book list because I've already read it or listened, so I get credit. And now my husband needs to read it again. It was the right like recipe of the personal, and listening to him, like, man, I knew some of these things, like, because we've talked about them or because I've read, some of your articles, but actually like listening to the depth of it. And also I was so inspired, and we'll get into that more, but I want to just first ask you, like, the title is powerful, why do we struggle to talk so much about trauma? But like, why do we struggle culturally or in society to talk about trauma?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I'll go individually first. I think individually we do because it's so horrifically painful, and it creates all these narratives in our own heads, and quite often they do internalize and they create blame on ourselves, and they make us feel like people are going to judge us, people are not going to think enough of us, people aren't going to want to be friends with me, people aren't going to want a relationship with me. What if people at work find out? Because then they're going to think that I'm not capable. All these things going on in our head. And so individually it's really hard, and I think we're still in that, we're getting better, but we're still in a society where it's still very hard to do that. And again, it's like people caveat with it like, oh, well, I'm not a victim, or I'm not weak, or I'm not. And it's like, nothing about my story is weakness. Everything about it is incredible strength. So it's like a distorted view, which comes from society. So I think in wider society, it's very difficult because society collectively does judge, because again, it's this thing of like, well, we all need to be strong, and we can't be, especially for women as well, emotions are seen as like, or letting your emotions out was seen as a weakness, and can sometimes still be seen as a weakness. It's like, what? It's actually the total opposite. But again, like, history takes time to change, and sometimes that's a wider society, and people find it hard sometimes as a society and as an individual to face the things that we've gone through, and we do like a coping mechanism of pretend to help us sometimes get through life. But the problem is a healthy coping mechanism to use sometimes, like to turn up to a meeting, you might need to be able to detach from the things that's going on for you. In fact, when I was filming Scamander, I was going through a very difficult time, and I had to use some coping mechanisms to be able to like detach from what I was feeling so deeply inside, or to be able to kind of compartmentalize my emotion. But if I do that all the time, then it becomes so destructive. And so I think, again, we live in that society that is changing, but it's still very difficult. So for me, it was like, oh, for God's sake, like, it's okay to talk about it. And then I wanted the book to be quite loud in that sense, because it is like in bold why it's okay to talk about trauma. And, the thing that I find so damaging is the aftermath of trauma. Trauma obviously is the thing, like a traumatic experience, and again, I'm a bit funny with the definitions, because for me, like, I went through a lot of domestic abuse, child abuse, and emotional control, coercive control, and that is a day-to-day thing every single day. It's not one event, it's not a traumatic event that happened.
Can we define that really quickly? Because actually that was one of the things I found most helpful, and that was in the beginning of the book. And again, as someone who's read books on this and gone through years and years of different types of therapy, like, I've never heard it stated as simply and clearly as you outline it. And so you talked about the types: acute, chronic, and complex, and then the causes. And I can, I have notes on those if you want me to read them, but like you just said, there's multiple types. I think people are like, oh, you've been traumatized. This is the thing that happened. Well, yes, if you experienced a car accident, a divorce, something that was like a one-time thing.
Yeah, but those things can play out over time, over days of weeks and years of people's lives. So I think that's really careful when we do define. So yeah, my book basically really defines it, because I think that's really important, because we just use this overarching word of trauma. And again, people who've gone through sexual abuse, which sadly many of us have, that's something that is insidious. It has an emotional manipulation, grooming impact that happens over time as well. It's often not just one moment in time. Yeah, it's basically normally a lot of grooming behavior. And so when people say, oh, you've gone through a traumatic event, it's like, well, I have gone through lots of traumatic events, but to me, they're not events. They're things that were like part of my life on a day-to-day basis. And it's really important to address that, because that's how you then shape your worldview and view of yourself. So if you see it as one particular event, then it minimizes what you've been through. And why it's important not to minimize is because if you minimize, how can you heal something and process and work through something that you're minimizing and making this tiny little thing? You aren't going to. It's like, how can we grow? How can we work through? How can we heal? How can we get over, which I hear used a lot of the time, if we won't acknowledge what we've been through in the first place?
There was a few parts that you were talking about, like even in your own resistance initially to call it trauma or to call it abuse. And I really resonated with that. I mean, even thinking about like some of the things that happened to me or my own childhood, I would say, well, but that wasn't abuse because, well, one, I knew someone that had it worse. So I was like, well, if I say that that was abuse, then this person that was like really injured, or like I was date raped, but I was like, but that was someone I was dating. That's not as bad as someone that like jumped out of the bushes and assaulted me. So that's not rape. You know, all of these ways that we try to protect ourselves. I'd love to talk about that, because it was an ongoing process for you to even identify the fact that this is trauma.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for sharing that about yourself too, and I'm sorry that you went through that. I'll just quickly comment on that, because that's interesting analogy you just used, and it wasn't really an analogy, it was your experience, but interesting about what you said. Well, it's worse if somebody, but is it? Because they're not comparable, but that was somebody that you were dating, that's somebody you trusted, that's somebody you believed in. That's an awful, horrific violation of yourself. And it's also a huge violation of your trust that will cause you to then have behaviors that then protect you from that moving forward, which could mean you're protecting yourself against somebody who is actually wonderful. Sorry, going to your question in terms of like myself. Yeah, because for myself, it was normal. And again, we normalize a lot of things and we do go, oh, well, you know, it's not as bad. Well, let me tell you, there's always going to be somebody who you perceive is having it worse, and there's always going to be somebody you perceive who's having it less. And it's not about really comparing about your own experience. And for me, like, I was raised in a very abusive home, and I was physically and emotionally abused in that home, but that was my normal.
Well, especially as a child, you don't necessarily have something to compare it to.
Yeah, as a child, because I didn't know any different, right? So then I would have never labeled it anything. Obviously, it wasn't like I was like, oh, this is fine. But I was a child, so I had nothing to compare it to. And it was my normal because it was my normal. Not because I perceived it as my normal, because it was. And then, you know, as a teenager, I started to maybe like realize it wasn't, because I started to see other people's family dynamics and also see different relationships. But it was very hard because I was only modeled that, and I had to do so much work as an adult to try and acknowledge that it was. And the reason why it's so hard, that it was abuse, and I knew it was, but like, it's very hard to acknowledge that, because then you have to go, this is why trauma is really hard. And that's why, you know, go back to your original question. Trauma is really hard. And I'll explain it in my own context in the question you just asked. For me to go, my entire childhood was abusive. And every day that is what I faced. And I was incredibly sad, lonely, hurt child that was already an adult and was already trying to caretake and protect. And oh yeah, that it's so hard to face. Oh, and by the way, then I went and joined a running group, and I was a really good runner, and then my coach groomed and sexually abused me. Oh, that was my life. That's really hard to face, because that is like, that's hard to face. And that's why it's like, to identify that.
And then you lost friends that were also abused by that coach who committed suicide. I mean, that's another thing. To even just losing someone close to you to suicide is also another massive trauma.
Yeah, because of the abuse the coach did to us. Yeah, like 2 people, Georgina and Katie, like say their names, you know, have died by suicide because of what we went through, which again just shows the long-term impact of trauma and of abuse. But that's why, and again, it's very hard to face, because then you've got to face your life, and sometimes looking back and going, oh, that was my life, is so difficult. However, it's the most important thing to do, because again, if I for a long time just like pushed it behind me, and for so many reasons, like I couldn't I couldn't understand it. I couldn't cope with it. I was trying to survive. I was in survival mode all the time. I didn't have anything to fall back on, people to fall back on, support. Like I had to depend on myself and create what I have for myself. And a lot of that was trying to create safety and trying to create full independence, as in, so I was fully financially independent and had my own safety. And like, there's so many things I could discuss with this, but one of the most important things I kind of want to get across is that, yes, that did protect me in that moment, but it also kept me in a cage where I also didn't allow the good stuff. That good stuff, real friendship, real love, genuine care, is actually what I needed to heal, because all my trauma, the majority of people's trauma does come from some kind of relationship in any form. So like family, friendship, like my running coach, it comes through connection a lot of the time. And then what it does is it makes us clamp down and then shy away from connection, because how can we trust? It teaches us to mistrust, right? And that is really damaging. That's something I've had to try and work. I've worked through so much, and it's something I'm so conscious of, and it probably always will be part of my life, but I understand it and I can recognize it. And that is how you heal through trauma. It's not about getting rid of it so it never exists anymore, because that's getting rid of a part of yourself. I am a child that was raised in that. I am a child that was scared every day for myself and for my family. My mum, I've got brothers. Like, I learned to be quiet. I learned to not cry. I learned to not make a noise in case something happened. And I also learned how to protect. Like, I'm very protective. Because of that, is like I learned to care deeply, because I see, like, going back to Scamander, the episode we've just done, like, I see your pain so clearly from what happened. I see your pain not as a journalist. I see your pain as somebody that understands what it feels like.
You make me cry now. It's also, though, it's why you're so compassionate, and like, it's why people open up to you, is because even that they don't know your background, it's because they can feel that. Like, they can feel your care of their feelings and their hearts. I want to talk, because I know we don't have a lot of time, I want to talk about trauma shaping behaviors, because one thing that you and I very much have in common is, we've coped in somewhat different ways, but a lot of the ways that we've coped is through perfectionism and overachieving, both of us. That is a way that's very rewarded, or overworking, right? That's very rewarded. So how did you start to recognize those patterns? Because I will tell you, everyone listening to this, if you're a podcast listener in personal growth, you are probably a high achiever. You might be a perfectionist. So how can someone recognize that pattern and work with it, heal it, because I'd always say, yeah, but I'm not over drinking. I'm not doing some of the things that I think are labeled as negative. I'm, no judgment, on people that have different expressions, but I'm like, I just work really hard and I'm achieving a lot and I don't sleep very much. And now literally listening to the book, I was like, oh God, I feel so seen right now.
I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because you mentioned behaviors. So trauma presents in behaviors. And that's why, like, if you're trying to understand what you're feeling or how your trauma affects you, it's behaviors. And I really detail this out in the book to help you understand and recognize your own behaviors. We have different behaviors. You and I, Rebecca, have similar, what I would label as unhealthy behaviors. Look, high achieving and things like that is great, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about overworking and perfectionism. I'm so glad you made that point, because I talk about this in the book. It's the thing that's rewarded in society. So then it's very hard for people to recognize that you're not okay and that you're going through trauma. That's something that I still sometimes now, like, I pull myself up on, and I also vocalize to people, because people still sometimes don't recognize, my friends and family, that when I'm not okay, because I don't present in a way where, when I'm not okay, I don't present in a way which is recognized in society. I do cry, but like, as a child, I learned not to cry because crying made things worse.
I was told, I'll give you something to cry about.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. That's awful.
Oh, no, but I mean, that it resonated when you were...
Yeah, but it's like, and again, you then learn, so we're very clever. Like, you learn how to survive. We have coping mechanisms to survive. So a child will then learn what they need to do to protect themselves when you're raised in that kind of environment. And also, like, even if it's something that's not what we would call, like, necessarily quote abusive, but like it is, like neglectful parents, not getting enough validation, attention and love, that can show up where the child will then act out, do things, and then they'll be labeled naughty. It's not because they're naughty, it's because they want to be seen by you. So our behaviors are everything, right? And so then for me, it was like, well, this is where perfectionist develops. And I talk a lot about perfectionism because it's just not recognized. And then it's very hard for you to identify yourself because you're like, yeah, but look at all the things I'm doing. And honestly,
well, and you're getting validation, which you're craving. It also creates opportunities, which is freedom and independence.
Yeah, exactly. Which was everything that I was striving for. And I remember when I first sat with a clinical psychologist and I talk about my journey with her in the book. I remember she asked me some questions and then I said, well, yeah, I'm struggling with da-da-da, but I'm fine because look at all these things that I'm doing. And they were like my mask.
That was my first time I sat down with a life coach, and she's like, so tell me about, like, I don't remember the exact question, but basically I rattled off the next 20 years of my career and how I was going to be CEO of the company I was at the time. And it was very impressive sounding. And then she just kind of paused and she goes, what do you actually want? And I just broke down because I'm like, that was never the question. People are like, what are you going to accomplish? Because you're a high achiever, which just feeds that cycle.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, like I wasn't necessarily, it was just my behavior, as in, because that to me, it started from a young age because I felt like if I achieved that, then maybe then I would get the acceptance and love. Yeah.
Respect. Well, and you said this in the book you talked about, and I've heard it in a few other books too, about this need of like, we want to be fully seen and heard and valued or validated.
But it's important to say that that's not necessarily what we consciously think. We might not recognize that. It's anybody's basic need. The basic needs aren't just food and water and shelter. A basic need is feeling loved, is feeling seen, is feeling connection and feeling purpose. They're also our basic needs to exist emotionally healthily. It's not just food and shelter. In terms of like perfectionist behavior, that is actually a symptom in a way of somebody that's not okay and that's gone through a lot of trauma and that is struggling mentally, because perfectionism is trying to control, because then if you can do everything to the best of your ability, then it tries to control and stop bad things from happening. So that's a lot of where it comes from, and it's really hard sometimes to recognize. And look, achievement is amazing. I'm so proud of everything I've done. I mean, I always loved it, but I achieve not because I need to keep surviving because I'm scared of something happening and I've got to keep going and I've just got to keep going because what if it all falls apart and I'm not good enough like this, and I just need to,
What's the difference of discernment and alignment is you're doing things now that like light you up and excite you, and you're not getting all of your value from them.
Well, no, they always did light me up and excite me. But whenever I did something, it was never enough. So they lit me up and excited me and gave me the kick and the feeling I needed because I was like feeling numb. And so often, and depression comes out in numbness a lot of the time, I'd go and do something and I'd get that validation and then I'd get that like, I am enough.
But you need it again. It's an ongoing hit that you have to get.
Yes, it's like addiction. So again, you made a really good point about it might not be, drinking in excess, but it's not about the particular thing. It's about extremity of excess. So like, I also over-exercised and over-trained all the time. I was always training. I was always exercising. And I don't even believe in balance either. I was just going to say, it's not about balance. Like balance, again, is just something that you're going to try and seek, which will then make you feel like a failure and not good enough, because it swings and roundabouts in life. Like at the moment, I've got an intense schedule and my balance is out of whack. My balance is always out of whack. Like sometimes I go to the gym more and I work more. Like it's just sometimes things happen. Like, life, we go through things, and it's about like being okay with it, not constantly trying to fight to have balance all the time. The importance of recognizing perfectionist behavior is because you will never feel good enough, and so you will constantly strive, you will neglect yourself and self-care, and ultimately trauma creates a false narrative about how we feel about ourselves and that we aren't enough. And so, I mean, I sound like I'm being really blunt here, but I think it's important to be sometimes, and there is no blame to yourself. This unhealthy behavior is often subconscious. We're not doing it on purpose. We're doing it to try and cope and to try and give us what we need. But it's important to really recognize it, because ultimately you are perpetuating the behavior and not giving yourself what you need, because you will never feel enough by striving. And often that's when we have breakdowns. That's when we totally burn out. And then feel really bad about ourselves. And again, it self-perpetuates the feeling of not enough. So my book talks about everything to do with high achieving, over perfectionism, but those behaviors come from the same foundation of over exercise, over watching television, and over gaming. That's also a similar behavior. Over using control for eating, whether it's overeating, binge eating, not eating enough. It's the same with drinking. It's the same with drugs. It's about extremity, and some of us will use different things to be able to get that feeling that we're missing. So it's about looking underneath and being like, why am I doing that? Oh, because I don't feel. Often it comes from a place of not feeling like we're good enough. And often that comes from the messages that we've learned in childhood. And they're not even our own messages. So it's about reframing that in your brain and reteaching yourself. And that's what I did a lot.
Well, and your book it's not only like a teaching memoir. I mean, I learned so much from it. And I learned about you, obviously, which was fascinating the way you tell the story. But the other thing is there's so many different tools in it, which I want to highlight, is different tools to help people. So it's not just, learn this, be aware. And I think that's what stuck out to me, as I was like, oh, I've done a lot of awareness and I've done a lot of therapy, but I was like, there's a lot of opportunity to do more of like the healing, the integration outside of just the awareness itself, right?
Because again, the high achievers and perfectionist behavior and people that are very good at learning will learn everything there is to know. They will know about trauma. They'll know about awareness, but then they won't go to the next level. And the next level is you can understand it till the cows come home, which is really important, by the way. I'm not knocking that because I do a whole thing in my book about understanding it. But the key is emotionally connecting with it. And that's the difference. So the book has tools in it to help you try and emotionally connect. Because processing trauma doesn't happen in your intellect. You have to have your intellect to be able to connect then with your emotion, which is hard to do because sometimes people use their intellect to protect them from feeling what they are feeling. And I definitely did and found it very hard to connect to my emotions because sometimes they just felt too much.
You give an analogy that was so helpful for me about the trauma itself, right? The memory is like plywood. It's like thin. And I think a lot of people, they'll talk about their traumatic memories. I know myself, and someone might argue with that. And because maybe you remember a piece of it or you remember it really clearly, you think, but the feelings, the emotions are the oak shelf. Like those are the things that are really substantial. And that really is what punishes us or we suffer from for years after the event itself. And that was so helpful to think of it that way. Because I'm like, you can argue that, because I've argued with people that I had traumatic situations with. They're like, no, that's not how it happened. And I'm like, at the end of the day, this is my memory, which may be flawed, but the feelings are very real.
Yeah, there's a lot of analogies in the book around that, and then also then what to do with it. But you're absolutely right. It's like our emotion is very strong and it will stay there. And that's kind of what you're talking about in terms of the plywood. And then just because the memories might be from 10 years ago or 20 years ago, if the emotion hasn't worked through and helped, then it will just be as strong as it was 10 years ago. And that's why sometimes we get like such a visceral reaction to things that might have happened 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, but it doesn't mean that the emotion's not still there and as strong, and that feeling. You can work through that. But again, you can't work through that if you don't acknowledge the emotion in the first place and feel it. Like you've got to grieve for the things that you've been through. You've got to grieve for yourself. But a lot of my working through things was allowing myself to grieve for the pain that I felt inside and grieve for the things that I'd gone through and being like, that was really awful. No wonder you feel like that. No wonder you think that. No wonder you're saying these critical things to yourself. No wonder you sometimes get down. Look at what you've gone through. And so it's important to look back to help you be compassionate to yourself and to work through what you're feeling now. Like looking back, and the past isn't in the past. It's part of us every day. You know, while we continue to do that and we shut it down, then we're just not acknowledging who we are. For a long time, because of what I've gone through, and because I shut that out, and because I was so angry about it, and also like there was a lot of like, hate's a very strong word, but there was a lot of hate for that part of me. So like, you know, I hated that I was abused. I hated that I was groomed and sexually abused. So I hated that part of my life, and I hated that part of me. But that is still me. So then how can I walk around as a grown adult and feeling that, you know, cared for, loved, feeling like you can be happy in life when there's a chunk of me, it's still me that went through that I then I'm horrible to and I hate on. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like that poor girl that went through that needs the opposite from me. And all I'm doing is repeating the same behaviors by being horrible to myself of like these people were to me.
It's such a powerful reminder to me. And one of the tools in your book is the writing of letters. And I shared in the earlier episode, I wrote letters last week to several people in my life that had created trauma. And it was so healing. The other thing, and I'm going to say this to you for accountability when we talk about going through grief, because it was really good to go through anger and sadness. But one of the things that I have not done, and I got called out on this a full year ago and still haven't done it, is I've never grieved my boyfriend in the past. I've never allowed myself to grieve. I mean, I went to his funeral and I spoke and all those things. I've never just given my, like in the past, anytime something happened that was really sad, I'd be like, you got 5 minutes to cry. You got 5 minutes. And then you're going to make an action plan.
That is, imagine if you said that to me, if you said, Charlie, you've got 5 minutes to cry about, well, you know, the things that you've gone through, and then I want you to make an action plan. That's like so horrible to yourself.
Or sometimes I'll give myself an evening to be lazy. If I'm dealing with something, you can not do the things you're supposed to do or you said you do tonight, but then you're going to get up early tomorrow and do it.
Yeah, I understand that. I recognize that behavior. That's something that I did. And it's really common for people that have gone through a lot of things. And that's something that I think just recognizing that. And because again, it's like you're making yourself cry on tap. That's not real cry. That's like, it is real crying, but it's like, you know, you've got 5 minutes to cry. Okay. Okay, stop. Like, that's like,
well, because it like you shared a story about a girl that was always crying in one of your groups, and same thing. I was like triggered by it because anybody that just like cries all the time, no judgment. Like I am great at holding space for other people, but like I don't hold that space for myself. And it just was a reminder that I not only deserve to do that, it's still a very necessary part. But I will just say the letter you wrote to yourself that you read at the end was so beautiful. It made me cry. And I'm like, oh, I've done some inner child work and I've done some mirror work, but I haven't written that letter to myself. And I am committing to doing it because that made me cry reading your letter to yourself, like the love and care you had for yourself. I'm like, and my daughter, my Vivi, you've met her. Like when I picked her up yesterday, she goes, how's little Becky doing? She calls me little Becky, which is no one called me little Becky. They just called me Becky, which I don't like. I'm like, I actually disassociate from that name. I'm like, don't call me Becky. That's not who I am, because Becky was the one that went through a lot of trauma. Yeah. So I'm going to write the letter to little Becky.
Yeah, I hope you do. And just to explain very quickly, like that's at the very end of the book. And it's not a letter to like what you would tell your younger self. It's not one of those. It's a letter that is proven in psychology, and it's what I did at the very end of all the clinical psychology work I did. And then I was part of a trauma group, and then I went on and studied trauma therapy, but it's like schema therapy, which is like patterns of behavior, which we develop from trauma in adults, which is how I really believe we can work through things and reshaping that behavior. And so that letter at the end is very much, once you've worked through things, it's something that's really, I think, really important to do, and I'll let people go and have a look at it. It's not the like, you know, what would you tell your younger self? It's a very specific letter, which is really important, connecting to how you've been made to feel through the things that you've got.
Yeah, it's almost like a reparenting letter.
It's really powerful. That's the letter that's in my book, Why It's Okay to Talk About Trauma, is the actual letter that I did for my therapy. It was not for a book. And it took me a lot of time to decide whether I wanted to put that in the book, because that wasn't written for a lot of the stuff in there is stuff from my own experience of what I went through, you know, with really specific trauma, psychology and therapy. And yeah, so the letter is the actual letter I wrote to myself at the very end of my 3 years of psychology work and trauma psychology in groups too.
Thank you for being so open and giving permission for others and just allowing your story to teach and help people heal. And it absolutely is a must read, or listen in my case. I actually loved listening to it because I am used to hearing you from the podcast.
It's my voice. Yeah. So I think it depends on you, because some people like to read and they can note take in it, you know, or come in and drop in and come back to it. But then some people like to listen, and listening is a different experience because it is me talking to you. And so hopefully that helps you navigate it and feels comforting.
Well, I would recommend for everyone, because I actually have a paper copy, physical copy, and the Audible copy. And that's how I like to consume, is if I want to take notes on something. So first of all, where can everyone get it?
It's on Amazon. It's on some of the bookstores. So yeah, it's called Why It's Okay to Talk About Trauma. And yeah, it's on all the usual places. Why It's Okay to Talk About Trauma by me, Charlie Webster.
And you can go follow Charlie on Instagram as well at Charlie Webster. Charlie, thank you so much for so many things. Thank you for your own role in my healing because of your bravery and for being so willing to put yourself out there and all the things that you've not just gone through, but the things that you've learned because they're helping so many people.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I love how this has developed from the first moment that we initially talked. So thank you. And thank you for trusting me those years ago.
Appreciate you. All right, everyone, go grab a copy of the book and make sure to take time because it's a lot to process. I mean, processing your own story, your own traumas is a lot. As Charlie said, it's not something you just sit down and do it in 15 minutes. So whether it's writing or therapy or just beginning to talk about it, you deserve to heal. And if you love this episode and you got something out of it, share it with someone that you know could benefit.